Hey, my name is Grant Pellman. I'm 30 years old, and I work as a print production specialist at a small commercial printing company called Meridian Press, tucked into a low concrete building on the eastern edge of Terre Haute, Indiana, a city that has exactly one thing most people know it for and an entire quiet life happening that they never see. My job is to take the things people want to exist on paper and make them actually exist on paper. Menus, annual reports, event programs, wedding invitations, product catalogs for manufacturers who still believe a printed page does something a website cannot, which I happen to agree with. I run the presses, I manage the color proofing, and I troubleshoot the jobs that come back wrong, the ones where the registration is off by a fraction of a millimeter, or the ink density has shifted across the run, or the customer is looking at a finished product and saying it doesn't match what they approved. And I have to look at both things and explain precisely what happened between the intention and the result. What I've learned from 9 years of doing this is that everything that ends up on paper starts as something invisible, a color value, a line weight, a measurement in points that nobody outside the industry cares about. My job is to keep what's invisible from disappearing, to hold it steady through every stage of the process, until it becomes something the person can hold in their hands and say, yes, that's what I meant. That's the thing. I wake up at 6:15, shower, make coffee in the kitchen of the house I rent on the south end of Spring Hill Road, and eat cereal or toast standing at the counter, reading through whatever proof corrections came in overnight. I drive the 14 minutes to Meridian, start the press warm-up sequence, check the color targets, and work until 5 or sometimes 6 or sometimes later if there's a rush job finishing. I stop at the grocery most evenings on the way home. I cook something simple. I watch a little news, then the weather, then I read until 10:30. I go to sleep. There is nothing wrong with this routine. I want to be clear about that, because the way I'm about to describe it might make it sound like I was suffering. And I wasn't. I was fine. I had the job I'd trained for, the house I wanted, the town I'd chosen to stay in when staying had been the easier option, and it turned out the easier option was also the right one. I was fine. It was just that fine had started to feel like a color that was slightly off register. Close enough that most people wouldn't notice. Exactly enough off that I noticed every day. I had been close to something better once. Her name was Julia, and we had been together for 3 years, and she had moved to Indianapolis for a graduate program, and we had tried the distance for 8 months, and then stopped trying in the mutual, deflating way of two people who both knew the truth of it, but neither wanted to say it first. That was 2 years ago. We had been perfectly decent to each other all the way to the end, which was its own specific kind of sadness that I found harder to get over than a fight would have been. There was nothing to be angry at. There was just the absence, and the absence was exactly the shape of her. After Julia, I kept to myself mostly. Not in a damaged way, in the practical way of someone who understood what it cost to open that particular door and had decided to be careful about when. That first Tuesday in April, 8 months ago, I arrived at work to find a paper bag on my desk. I almost assumed it was a mistake. I stood in the door of my workspace, a partitioned area near the back of the press floor, with a proofing table and a monitor, and the kind of overhead lighting that is designed to be neutral and manages instead to be slightly depressing. And I looked at the paper bag sitting on my desk and tried to think of a reasonable explanation for it that involved someone other than me. There was a sticky note on it. The sticky note said, "Pastrami on rye. The deli on Wabash makes them right." I did not know who W was. I looked around the floor. The pressmen were running the morning's first job. The bindery crew was at the cutting table. Nobody was looking at me in the way of someone who had left something for me and was waiting to see my reaction. I ate the sandwich, It was, in fact, made right. The kind of pastrami sandwich where the meat is warm and thick, and the mustard is sharp, and the rye bread has a specific chew to it that means someone has made a real decision about bread. I ate it at my desk at noon, and I thought, this is the best thing that has happened to me in a while, and that is both a good thing and a slightly concerning thing about the state of my life. The next day there was another bag, a different note, roast beef this time. I wasn't sure which you'd prefer, so I'm running a test, WA test. I looked around the floor again. Still nothing. I ate the roast beef. The third day was a container of soup, lentil, with bread, and the note said, "You looked cold yesterday." I'm not sure that's medically how it works, but I made extra anyway. By Thursday, I had started leaving the door of my workspace open. By Friday, I was curious enough that I asked Marcus, who ran the front press and had been at Meridian for 11 years and knew everything about everyone in the building the way veteran pressmen always do, whether he knew who W was. He looked at me. Then he looked toward the front office area where the sales and customer service team sat. "Winnie," he said. "Winnie Cho. Been here 4 months. Customer accounts." "Do you know why she's—" "No," he said. He said it with the particular brevity of a man who has an opinion he has decided not to share yet. I went back to my desk and thought about it. And then I stopped thinking about it and did the afternoon's color proofing, which needed doing. On Monday there was a note that said, "I hope the weekend was good. Chicken salad today. The kind with actual tarragon." I stood at my desk with the note in my hand for a moment. Then I picked up a red proofing pen, which was the nearest writing instrument, and I wrote on the back of the note, "The weekend was quiet. The chicken salad is the best thing I've eaten in a month. Thank you." I walked to the customer accounts area, which I had been past 100 times and had never particularly looked into, and I put the note on the only desk that had a small potted plant on it and a cardigan draped over the chair back, because those details seemed like they belonged to a person who made soup, because someone looked cold. I went back to my press. She came to find me 2 days later. I was at the proofing table, holding a press sheet at an angle to the light to check a color match on a job that was running slightly warm in the magentas, and I heard the door. The door I had started leaving open, and I looked up. She was small, not in a way that was the first thing you noticed, but in a way that clarified itself as she came closer. The kind of person who occupies their space precisely and completely, without needing more of it. She was wearing a gray cardigan over a white shirt with a small ink stain on the left cuff. Not from the press floor. The wrong color for that, which meant she had done something involving a pen recently and hadn't noticed yet. Her hair was black, cut to about the jaw, and slightly tucked behind one ear in an asymmetrical way that I would come to understand was not a style choice, but a habit she made when she was thinking. Her eyes, when they found mine across the proofing table, had a quality of alertness that was particular and unhurried, like a person who is always looking at something carefully and is not in a rush to finish looking. She was holding my note. "G," she said. "Grant," I said. "I know," she said. "I've worked here 4 months. I just wasn't sure if you were a Grant or a Greg or a—" She stopped. "You're a Grant. What does that mean?" I said. "It means the name fits," she said. "Some names don't fit the person, and it's a small, constant wrongness. Yours fits." I did not have a response to this. I put the press sheet down. "I wanted to say you're welcome," she said. "In person." Because a note back was nice, but it felt like the equivalent of a text reply to a voicemail. "Is that a scale?" I said. "There's a whole chart," she said. "It's mostly about proportionality. You match the medium to what you're actually saying." "And what were you saying?" I said. She held my gaze for a moment. Something in her expression was careful, Not guarded, but measured, like someone who has a precise amount to say and is deciding if this is the right moment for it. "I was saying good morning," she said, "every day, in a medium I was pretty sure you'd actually receive." She went back to customer accounts. I stood at the proofing table and looked at the press sheet with the warm magentas for a while without seeing it. The lunches continued every day. Not the same lunch. Winnie Cho had opinions about food that were specific and rotating and occasionally educational. There was a Tuesday in April with a Vietnamese soup she had made at home and brought in a thermos that, she noted in the accompanying message, required reheating for exactly 4 minutes, and not more. There was a Friday with a slice of her mother's scallion pancake recipe, which she had made the previous evening, and which she wrote about in the note with the slightly formal precision of someone dictating a technical specification. "This is best eaten within 3 hours. Do not refrigerate. The layering is the point, and refrigeration destroys the layering." I ate everything. I started writing longer notes back. Not emotional notes, informational ones, the way my replies in the professional context always were. I told her about the job I was working on. I told her about the specific quality of a color match when it's done exactly right, the way the printed sample and the color standard become visually identical, and you can only tell them apart by touching them. I told her about a customer who had ordered 500 invitations with the wrong date, and had only noticed after I'd completed the run, which was a story I told with the flat, factual affect of someone who has made peace with human error as a constant professional condition. She wrote back about a client call that had gone wrong in a specific way. The client had wanted something she had advised against and then been unhappy with the thing they had insisted on, which was the specific tax you pay for having good judgment in a service role. She described it with dry precision. I read it twice. We had not yet had a conversation longer than 5 minutes in person. All of it was notes. I thought about this sometimes and then thought about the color target work and went back to the press. The notes got longer. Mine started with 1 or 2 lines and grew, the way things grow when you've found a medium that works for you and you stop rationing it. I told her about the printing process in more detail than anyone had ever asked me to go into, about how color is not a fixed thing, but a relationship between light and surface and the chemistry of the ink, about how a color that looks perfect on a monitor exists in an entirely different color space than a color that looks perfect on coated stock, and that my entire job was translating between these spaces without losing what the designer actually intended. She asked follow-up questions that were better than I expected. She asked whether there was ever a case where the printed version came out better than the original intent, and I had to stop and think about this seriously before I said, "Sometimes, yes. Sometimes the paper does something the screen couldn't, and the result is more precise than what was planned." And those were the jobs I thought about afterward. She wrote back, "That's what happens with a recipe sometimes. The limitation forces a decision that turns out to be the better one. My mother makes soup differently in winter than in summer because of what's available, and the winter version is better." I read this at my desk and then sat with it for a moment, which I did not often do with things I read. About 6 weeks in mid-May, she stopped by the proofing room on her way to a client call and said, in the same business-like tone she used for everything, "Do you want to have lunch here sometime? I mean sitting down together, not the drop-off system." I almost said I usually ate at my desk. The part of me that had been careful for 2 years said, "This is how it starts, and you know what it costs." The other part, quieter but present, said, "You've been reading these notes twice." "Yeah," I said. "I do." We started eating lunch together on Tuesdays. This became Tuesdays and Thursdays. This became, by June, a standing fact of my day that I noticed the absence of on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays in the specific way you notice when a color target has been removed from the proofing station and the comparison has nothing to calibrate against. I noticed this, and I noted it. In the private accounting I kept for things that mattered, and I did not do anything about it yet. One Thursday in early June, we ended up staying late because she had a client call that ran long and then needed to revise a quote. And I had a job finishing that was giving me a density problem I couldn't leave unsolved, and at 6:30 we were the last two people in the building. I walked through to the customer accounts area to tell her I was locking the front, and she was still at her desk, the cardigan on against the office's aggressive air conditioning, finishing the quote, and she looked up and said, "Do you want to get dinner?" Since we're both already late. I said yes before the careful part of me could construct an objection. We went to a diner 3 blocks from the building because it was the nearest thing and neither of us had strong feelings about where. She ordered pancakes at 6:45 in the evening without any indication this required explanation. I ordered soup. She looked at my soup and looked at me and said, "You ordered soup at dinner in June." "I like soup," I said. "It's 80 degrees outside." "Soup doesn't have a season," I said. "That's one of the things I like about it." She considered this. "I disagree," she said. "Soup is contextual. The same soup in different weather is not the same experience." "You make your mother's soup in winter," I said, "because that's when it's available, and it's better. That's not the soup having a season. That's the soup finding its optimal context." She looked at me for a moment. "You remembered that." "I remember things that are precisely argued," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled, not the small, careful version, but the fuller one, the one that reached the corners of her eyes first, and said, "Okay, you get 1 point." I ate my June soup and thought about the point system and did not say anything else about it. What I knew about Winnie Cho by that point, she had grown up in Terre Haute, the younger of 2 daughters, the daughter of a father who had run an import wholesale business and a mother who had taught middle school art for 22 years and whose scallion pancakes were apparently non-negotiable. She had worked in customer service for a medical supply company for 3 years before Meridian, had taken the Meridian job because a friend had told her the company had good people, and was apparently finding this to be true. She read food writing the way I read color theory, as a serious practice, not a hobby. She had been to Chicago 14 times and could, she said, construct a reasonably defensible ranking of its restaurant neighborhoods by district. She had a sister named Priya, who called her every Sunday, and who apparently had strong opinions about Winnie's life choices, delivered with the loving certainty of an older sibling who has decided their expertise is comprehensive. Winnie described Priya with the specific, fond exasperation of someone who has accepted that being known very well and being managed are slightly different things. She did not talk about being hurt before. Not in those terms. But there were things she said in passing that I filed. The way she talked about the importance of saying clearly what you actually mean. The way she said once, over a Tuesday sandwich, that the worst thing you could do to a person was make them feel visible and then turn away. She said it about a client situation. And we both knew it was not entirely about a client situation. I did not say so. I finished my lunch and went back to press. The day I understood what the lunches actually were was a Thursday in early July. We were at the picnic table behind the building that the pressmen used for smoke breaks, and everyone else used for lunch when the weather was good. And it was good that day. The particular warm but not hot quality of an Indiana July morning that has not yet become afternoon. Winnie was telling me about a food market in Chicago she had visited the previous weekend, describing the stalls with the loving specificity of someone who had been paying close attention and I was listening and eating and watching the way she talked about things she cared about, with both hands involved, her expression open and unhurried, nothing performed. And I realized that I had been looking forward to Thursday since Tuesday. Not in a general way. In the specific way of someone who has a thing on the calendar that makes the intervening days have a quality of leading somewhere. I had not had a day feel like it was leading somewhere in 2 years. I sat with this and did not look at it directly. The way you don't look directly at a color target when you're checking a match. You let your peripheral vision do the work. Because the direct gaze introduces its own error. I was aware of what it was. I was just not ready to call it by its name. Because calling it by its name would require me to decide what to do about it, and I had been careful for 2 years, and the careful had served me. What I did instead was keep showing up. I kept writing the notes. I kept eating lunch on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I kept leaving the door open. I kept being present in the vicinity of the thing I wasn't naming yet. 2 weeks later, I found out about the promotion. She mentioned it in passing, on a Tuesday, the way she mentioned things that were not easy, directly, with a slight increase in the flatness of her voice. She had applied for a regional accounts manager position with a larger firm in Indianapolis. She had applied in April, before the lunches had started, when she had been newer at Meridian and less certain whether she was going to stay. The interview had gone well. There would be a second interview. I said the right things. I said it was a great opportunity. I said she should go to the second interview. I went back to my press and ran the afternoon's jobs and came home and ate standing at the counter and didn't read that night. I sat in the living room with no lights on for a while, which is something I haven't done since Julia, and which told me something specific about the state of things that I had been successfully not looking at directly. The lunches continued. I did not say anything about what I was not looking at. In August, her sister came to visit. I met Priya on a Friday when Winnie brought her to Meridian to see where she worked, which was apparently a tradition Priya enforced as a form of knowing her sister's life. Priya was taller than Winnie, with the same direct eyes but a more immediate quality of assessment in them, and she looked at me for about 6 seconds when Winnie introduced us, and then looked at Winnie with an expression Winnie returned, with a very slight narrowing of her eyes that clearly contained an entire private communication. "The lunch person," Priya said to me. "The sister," I said. "She talks about the notes," Priya said. "The notes you write back. She reads them twice." "Priya," Winnie said. "I'm making conversation," Priya said. I walked them through the press floor and showed them the proofing setup and explained what I did, and Priya asked 2 sharp questions about the color matching process and listened to the answers carefully. Before they left, she pulled me aside at the door in the very obvious way of someone who is not trying to be subtle and said, "She started the lunches 3 days after she started here. She brings lunch to her mother on Sundays, and she made an extra one day and brought it to you instead of putting it in the break room refrigerator. And then she just kept going. 4 months, every day. You should think about why that is." She left before I could respond. I stood in the doorway of the press floor and thought about 4 months of sandwiches and soup and scallion pancake with the specific layering instructions and all the notes I had written back. I thought about the first morning she had come to the proofing room door with my note in her hand and said the name fits. I thought about June's soup and the point system and the way she sat on the edge of the proofing table when we talked, like she belonged there, like the room had been arranged for 2 people and had been waiting. I felt something shift in my chest with the particular finality of a color registration correction that snaps 2 elements into exact alignment, the small, precise, unmistakable click of things that have been slightly off for a long time becoming right. I went back to the press and ran the afternoon's proofs. I ran them well. I was not thinking about them. I was thinking about the second interview in September and the offer that would likely follow it, and about what it would feel like to come to work on a Tuesday with a lunch bag and a note and find a desk that someone else was sitting at. I was thinking about how I had spent 2 years being careful, and the careful had not cost me anything yet, and it was about to. I was 30 years old, and I had spent 9 years learning that the gap between what something should be and what it becomes on paper is always closable if you're willing to go back to it enough times. I had run a proof 5 times once to close a gap of 0.5%. I was willing to go back to things. The question was whether I was going to go back to this one before she left or after. The second interview for the Indianapolis position was in September, a Monday. I knew the date because Winnie had mentioned it, and I had, with the precise memory of someone who tracks details for a living, not forgotten it. She came in on Tuesday looking contained, pressed together in a way I recognized as hers when she was holding something careful. She brought lunch, cold sesame noodles with cucumber, and a note that said, "Second interview went well. They'll let me know by end of month. I can't tell if I want them to call." I read the note 3 times. I had known about the second interview since she mentioned it the previous week. I had thought about it with the specific, sustained attention of someone doing a calculation they don't want to finish because they know what the answer is going to be. Indianapolis was an hour and 40 minutes from Terre Haute, which was not far and also not nothing, which was not the same distance as grad school in another city, which was a comparison I was making and shouldn't have been, except that I was making it. What I knew, sitting at the desk with the note, was that she had said she couldn't tell if she wanted them to call. Not, "I hope they call." Not, "I'm sure it'll be fine." She was telling me something in the precise, indirect language she used when she was telling me something she wasn't ready to say directly, and I knew how to read that language, and I had not yet decided what to do with what I was reading. I wrote back, "Why can't you tell?" She came to the proofing room door at 2 o'clock. "You know why?" she said. "Tell me anyway," I said. She came in and sat on the edge of the proofing table, which she had started doing in July, and which I had stopped registering as anything other than where she sat when we talked. She looked at her hands for a moment. "When I started here," she said, "I wasn't planning to stay. Terre Haute was a transition, not a destination. That's what I told myself." She stopped. "And then I started bringing you lunch, and you wrote back, and then we started sitting down together, and I started—" She stopped again. "I have been waking up in the morning and thinking about what I'm going to bring you," she said, "for 4 months. Every day. And I told myself it was just being friendly, and it wasn't just being friendly, and I've known that for a while, and I haven't said it because I wasn't sure if you—" She stopped completely. I was very still. "Why did you bring me lunch?" I said. "The first day. Before the notes, before any of it. Why that day?" She was quiet for a moment. "You were running a proof in the morning," she said, "and it wasn't matching, and you must have run it 5 times trying to get it right, and the color was close but it wasn't right, and you wouldn't stop. You kept going back to it, like it mattered that it was exactly right and not just close enough." She looked at me, and I thought, that's a person who cares about the gap between what something should be and what it is. And I had been not eating lunch alone in a new job for 3 months, and I wanted to say good morning to that person. Her voice had gone very quiet. Every day. I looked at her. "Winnie," I said. "I know," she said. She pressed her lips together. "I know it might have been too much." 4 months is a long time to be. It wasn't too much," I said. She looked at me. Her eyes were bright in the way of someone who is holding something together through the precision of their composure. "I've been watching you run those proofs for 4 months," I said. "And I've been watching the way you come to the door with the bag and the note, and the way you go back without waiting to see if I'm happy about it, like it's a thing you do for its own sake and not for the reaction. And I've been eating lunch with you twice a week since May, and I've been filing away every single thing you say like it's a color value I need to hold steady." I stopped. "The morning you said the wrong thing was telling the difference between visible and invisible, I thought about it for the rest of the week. Not because it applied to the client situation. Because it applied to me." I looked at the press sheet on the proofing table and then back at her. "I've been looking at you and seeing it perfectly clearly and not saying it, which is the thing I do, and which costs me things I don't always notice until they're gone. I'm trying not to do it this time." She was very still. "What are you seeing?" she said. "Someone I want to have lunch with every day," I said. "Not in the system, actually together." Her face did the thing then, the thing I had watched for 4 months and never seen fully, the thing she had been careful with. It just opened. Not dramatically, not with tears, not with a sound. Just the composure that she wore the way I wore mine, the careful held shape of it, letting go. Her eyes were wet and she was almost smiling. "I did it just to see you smile," she said, quietly, almost to the press sheet. "Every day I brought lunch I was hoping you'd smile. And sometimes you did, just a little, just reading the note. And I would go back to my desk and it would be enough for the whole day." I crossed the proofing table. I took her face in both hands and I kissed her. And she was warm and certain and tasted like the cold sesame noodles from the bag she had set on the corner of the table. And when I pulled back, she was looking at me with the direct, unhurried quality of her eyes, and she said, "4 months, Grant." "I know," I said. "That's a lot of sandwiches." "I'm going to owe you sandwiches for a long time," I said. She laughed. Short and genuine, and from somewhere that had not been guarded at all. She turned down the Indianapolis position. She called them on a Thursday in late September, and I sat in the proofing room and listened through the open wall to the professional, courteous voice she used for everything difficult but right. And when she came to the doorway afterward, she said, I withdrew. And I said okay, and she said it was the right job for a different version of where I thought I was going. And I said, I know. And she said, I'm not doing it for you. And I said, I know that too. And she looked at me with the direct eyes for a moment. And then she said, but you're part of the reason the math changed. And I said, good. And that was the whole conversation. Priya called that evening, which Winnie told me about the next day with the fond exasperation of someone whose older sister had been right about something and would be savoring this at moderate length. Priya had said apparently that it was about time, and had also said that any person who would run a color proof 5 times to get it exactly right was the kind of person worth staying in a city for, and this had made Winnie cry a little on the phone, which she was not going to tell me but told me anyway. Marcus, on the press floor, said nothing for 3 weeks. Then one morning in October he came by the proofing room, looked at the 2 coffee cups on the proofing table that were now a permanent feature, looked at me, and said, She fixed you. I wasn't broken, I said. No, he said. Off register. There's a difference. He went back to the press. It is February now. The pastrami sandwich from the deli on Wabash is still the best thing on the menu, which I have confirmed through careful comparison across multiple visits, a project Winnie has participated in with the rigor it deserves. Her mother's scallion pancake recipe is written on a card in Winnie's handwriting, in my kitchen, next to the stove, because the layering is the point, and I am learning the layering. Priya has visited twice. Each time she looks at me the way she looked at me the first time, and each time her expression has been slightly more settled, which I understand to be the highest available score. Meridian Press added a second proofing station in January because the volume warranted it. Winnie sometimes sits at the second station and works on client proposals while I run afternoon proofs, which is not something either of us planned and is something that feels completely correct in the way that a color match feels correct. Not because you decided it should, but because the numbers came out right. Last week I ran a job for a small restaurant on the east side of town. Their menu, a new one. Their first redesign in 11 years. The owner came in to proof it and stood at the table and looked at the printed version against the digital file and said, "Yes, that's it. That's exactly what I meant." I have been doing this job for 9 years and I still feel it when that happens. The small, precise satisfaction of holding the invisible thing steady all the way through until the person can see it and know it's right. I thought about the first note on the paper bag on my desk, about a woman who had watched me run a proof 5 times and decided that was the person she wanted to say good morning to. About how the most important things are sometimes invisible until the right person holds them steady long enough that you can finally see what was there the whole time. I had spent 9 years keeping the invisible visible, holding color values steady, closing the gap between what something should be and what it became on paper. I was careful about the gap, precise about it. What I had not understood until a woman left a sandwich on my desk with a note that said she was running a test was that the most important gap of all is the one between what you feel and what you say, and that the only way to close it is to find the person whose patience with you is, quietly and without announcement, longer than your silence.